In the summer of 1947, in a converted barn studio in East Hampton, on the eastern end of Long Island, a 35-year-old American painter named Jackson Pollock laid a large unprimed canvas flat on the wooden floor of his studio. He picked up a stick, he dipped the stick into a 1-gallon can of commercial enamel house paint, not artist's oil paint, but the kind of paint a contractor would use for trim and exterior walls. He stood over the canvas, he flicked the stick, loops, arcs, and skeins of glossy black liquid paint dropped onto the canvas in patterns that no Western painter had made before. Over the next 5 years, Pollock produced approximately 3 dozen large canvases using variations of this method. The works he produced in this 5-year window between 1947 and 1952 are considered by most major post-war art historians the most consequential American paintings of the 20th century. On the 11th of August, 1956, Pollock drove his car off a curve on Fireplace Road in East Hampton at high speed while drunk. He died at the scene. He was 44 years old. He had effectively stopped painting 4 years earlier. What I want to do in this episode is something a bit different from what you might expect. I am going to argue that the standard art historical mythology about Pollock, the lone American genius, the cowboy painter, the inventor of drip painting from nothing, is wrong in important ways. Drip painting was not invented in 1947. Pollock was not the first to use it. His specific innovation was something narrower and more interesting, and the way his fame was constructed in the years immediately after his death involved a series of careful institutional and political decisions that have only become fully visible to art historians in the last few decades. Jackson Pollock was born in Cody, Wyoming in January 1912, one of 5 sons of a small-time ranching and surveying family that moved repeatedly across the American West during his childhood. He spent his early years in Phoenix, Arizona, in Riverside, California, and in various small towns in between. He arrived in New York in 1930 at age 17 to study with Thomas Hart Benton at the Art Students League. Benton was the leading American regionalist painter of the period, a hostile critic of European modernism, a champion of vernacular American subjects, and a teacher who emphasized strict draftsmanship, anatomy, and the study of Italian Renaissance masters. Pollock studied with Benton for several years. The drawings and oil paintings he produced in the early 1932 show competent academic regionalist work in Benton's style, representational landscapes, figures, scenes of American rural life. He was, in his early 20s, not a particularly innovative painter. He was, by most contemporary accounts, including his own, technically uncertain. His draftsmanship was awkward. His anatomical proportions were often wrong. His compositional sense was sometimes muddled. In the late 1932, Pollock was hired by the Federal Art Project of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which had been established under the New Deal to provide income for American artists during the Depression. The WPA paid him a small monthly stipend in exchange for producing paintings that were eventually distributed to public buildings. Many of Pollock's WPA-era works have been lost or destroyed. The few that survive show a painter shifting away from regionalist representation toward heavier abstraction, with influences from Picasso's late Cubism, from Joan Miro, and from Mexican muralists, particularly José Clemente Orozco. During this period, Pollock also began experiencing serious alcoholism. He was hospitalized multiple times in 1937 and 1938 for what would now be called severe alcohol dependency disorder. He entered Jungian psychoanalytic treatment in 1939 with the analyst Joseph Henderson, a treatment program that would shape his artistic interests substantially over the next decade. Henderson encouraged Pollock to make drawings as part of the analysis process, drawings that drew on Jungian theory about archetypal imagery, the collective unconscious, and Native American and mythological symbolism. In 1942, Pollock met Lee Krasner, a young American painter who was, in many respects, a more sophisticated artist than he was at the time. Krasner had studied with Hans Hofmann, the German émigré painter who was teaching the most advanced abstract painting then available in New York. Krasner had a sharp critical eye, formal training in modernist principles, and a clear understanding of where European avant-garde painting had been moving. She married Pollock in 1945. She moved with him out to East Hampton in late 1945 into the Springs Barn studio that would be the site of his greatest works. Krasner's role in Pollock's development cannot be overstated. She introduced him to the leading critics of the New York art world. She introduced him to Peggy Guggenheim, who would give him his first major gallery show. She advised him on the formal direction of his work in ways that Pollock himself acknowledged. She also subordinated her own painting career for almost a decade to support his. The mythology of Pollock the lone genius is, in significant part, a mythology that the writing of American art history has constructed by underweighting Lee Krasner's role. In 1947, Pollock began working in what we now call his drip or pour method, the standard art historical account of this transition. The version that appeared in glossy magazines and that became the default cultural narrative presents it as a singular American innovation, sprung from Pollock's imagination, breaking with the entire tradition of Western easel painting. This is, in critical respects, false. Drip and pour techniques had been used by multiple painters in the decades before 1947. Janet Sobel, a Brooklyn-based Ukrainian-American painter who began painting in her 40s in 1938, had developed an all-over drip technique by 1944, her works from 1944 and 1945. Shown at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery, prefigure many of Pollock's innovations. Pollock saw Sobel's work at Guggenheim's gallery in 1945. By his own admission in interviews from the late 1940 seconds, Sobel's work was an influence on his approach. Other influences are well documented. The Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, with whom Pollock studied briefly in New York in 1936, had been experimenting with industrial paint techniques, including controlled dripping and pouring, since the 1920 seconds. Native American sand painters in the American Southwest, particularly Navajo sand painters whose work Pollock had seen in his Wyoming and Arizona childhood, used controlled pouring of colored sand to create ceremonial images directly on the ground. Pollock had seen sand painting demonstrations at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1941 as part of an exhibition called Indian Art of the United States. The catalog of that exhibition was in his studio library. What Pollock did in 1947 was synthesize these prior influences and apply them at a previously unattempted scale. The specific things Pollock contributed that were genuinely his own innovations. 1. The use of unprimed canvas. Pollock often left his canvas raw and unprimed, allowing the diluted enamel paint to soak directly into the canvas fibers in a controlled way. This produced a specific visual quality, a kind of stained into rather than painted onto effect that earlier drip painters had not achieved. 2. The scale. Pollock's mature drip paintings are large, typically 8 feet or more on the longer dimension. The largest mural of 1943, predating his pure drip method but pointing toward it, is over 20 feet long. Earlier drip painters had worked at modest scale. Pollock worked at architectural scale. 3. The intensity and density. Pollock applied paint in many layers, often working on a canvas for days or weeks. The mature drip paintings have a textural and compositional density that earlier drip painters had not attempted, a kind of pictorial weave that draws the eye into the canvas at every scale. From arm's length to inches away, these were genuine innovations. They were not, however, the wholesale invention of a new artistic method out of nothing. Pollock built on prior work. He absorbed influences from at least 6 identifiable sources: Sobel, Siqueiros, Native American sand painting, Hoffman's gestural teaching, Andre Masson's surrealist automatism, and Joan Miro's biomorphic compositions. He combined them in a particular way that no one before him had attempted at his scale. The mythology of the lone American genius drip painting his way into existence is partly true. He did make real artistic contributions, but it overstates the originality and erases the prior contributions of women painters, Mexican painters, and indigenous painters who had developed comparable techniques earlier. Pollock's pure drip period ran from 1947 to 1952. In those 5 years, he produced the works that critics, collectors, and museums have collectively decided represent his greatest accomplishments. In 1947 alone, he produced Cathedral and several other major canvases that established the new method. In 1948, he produced Number 1A, a roughly 6 by 8 foot canvas with black, white, and silver enamel poured in dense overlapping skeins, which became one of the most reproduced of all his works. In 1950, he produced Lavender Mist, Autumn Rhythm, and 1, Number 31, 3 of his largest and most ambitious works. 1, Number 31, measures 8 foot 8 inches by 17 foot 6 inches, making it among the largest pure drip paintings he ever produced. These 3 1950 works are widely considered the peak of Pollock's drip period. They are the paintings he had been working toward, and they would be the paintings on which his international reputation would substantially rest. The works were exhibited at Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. Pollock had moved to the Parsons Gallery in 1947 after Peggy Guggenheim closed Art of this Century to return to Europe. The Parsons shows of 1948, 1949, 1950, and 1951 were, in retrospect, the most consequential gallery exhibitions of mid-century American painting. Critical reception was, however, slow and uneven. In the immediate post-war years, much of the New York art critical establishment was skeptical of pure abstraction. The major critic Clement Greenberg championed Pollock's work in the pages of Partisan Review and The Nation, arguing that Pollock represented the emergence of a distinctly American modernist tradition that had absorbed European avant-garde lessons and pushed beyond them. But many other critics dismissed the drip paintings as chaos, gimmickry, or the trivial work of a man with limited drawing ability. In August 1949, Life magazine published a 4-page profile titled, "Jackson Pollock, Is He the Greatest Living Painter in the United States?" The question mark was significant. The article was tonally ambivalent, treating Pollock as a curiosity as much as a master. The accompanying photographs by Arnold Newman showed Pollock standing over a canvas on the floor of his East Hampton studio, in jeans and a denim shirt, with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, looking down at the painting like a cowboy, looking at livestock. The Newman photographs and a subsequent series taken by Hans Namath in 1950 would become some of the most influential photographs of any American artist of the 20th century. They constructed a visual vocabulary: the cowboy painter, the cigarettes, the denim, the dripping enamel that would, in the years following Pollock's death, sell Pollock to a global audience as a uniquely American artistic figure. Pollock collaborated with Namath on a short film, also in 1950, in which the painter is shown working on a canvas through a glass plate so that the camera looks up through the canvas at Pollock pouring paint downward onto its underside. The film made the actual process of drip painting visible to people who had never been inside a working artist's studio. It was, in retrospect, one of the earliest and most successful pieces of artist-celebrity content production in mid-century American culture. In late 1950, after a year of extraordinary productivity, Pollock relapsed. He had been sober for about 2 years, the period during which his greatest paintings had been produced. The sobriety had been part of what made the production possible, beginning in late 1950. After the success of the Namath photographs, and after a stressful and embarrassing collaboration with Namath on the film, Pollock began drinking again. His painting output declined dramatically through 1951 and 1952. He produced a series of black-only paintings on raw canvas in 1951, the so-called black pourings, which were generally received as less interesting than his color-rich 1948 to 1950 works. In 1952, he produced Blue Poles, a major late drip period work that has become particularly famous in Australia, having been acquired by the National Gallery of Australia for $2 million Australian dollars in 1973, in what was at the time a deeply controversial purchase that triggered a nationwide debate about modern art and public spending. After 1952, Pollock essentially stopped painting in the drip method. He produced very few paintings of any kind in 1953, 1954, 1955, or the first 8 months of 1956. He drank constantly, he fought with Lee Krasner, he moved out of their shared bedroom into a separate room in the East Hampton farmhouse. In July 1956, Pollock began an affair with a young art student named Ruth Kligman, who had come to East Hampton seeking him out. Lee Krasner left for Europe to give Pollock space. On the 11th of August 1956, with Kligman and her friend Edith Metzger as passengers, Pollock drove his Oldsmobile convertible off a curve on Fireplace Road in East Hampton at high speed drunk. The car flipped multiple times. Pollock was thrown from the vehicle and died at the scene. Metzger was also killed. Kligman survived. Pollock was 44 years old. He had spent the last 4 years of his life essentially not painting. The estate Lee Krasner inherited contained approximately 40 finished canvases from the drip period, plus a number of incomplete and uncatalogued works. Now we get to the part of the Pollock story that most casual accounts skip over, but that has been documented in detail since the 1,990 seconds, and that is, in my view, essential for understanding how Pollock's reputation was constructed in the years after his death. In the late 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, the United States Central Intelligence Agency was engaged in an extensive program of cultural diplomacy in Western Europe, intended to counter Soviet cultural influence. This program is now well documented through declassified CIA files and through the memoirs of former CIA officers, most notably Tom Braden, who ran the agency's international organizations division until 1954. Braden wrote a 1967 article in the Saturday Evening Post titled, "I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral," in which he described in detail the agency's secret financial support for non-communist American cultural institutions and figures during the early Cold War. One major beneficiary of CIA cultural funding was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a nonprofit organization founded in 1950, with significant, though concealed, CIA financial backing. The Congress operated in dozens of countries. It funded magazines including Encounter, Proves, Tempo Present, and Der Monat. It funded conferences, lectures, and critically for this story, art exhibitions. The Museum of Modern Art in New York, by far the most influential modern art museum in the world during the post-war period, was in this same era closely entangled with the CIA's cultural diplomacy program. The MoMA's International Council, established in 1953, organized traveling exhibitions of modern American art that were sent to Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia. The Council's funding came from a combination of private patronage and as documented by Frances Stoner Saunders in her 1999 book, The Cultural Cold War, The CIA and the World of Arts and Letters, and by Eva Cockcroft's earlier 1974 article in Art Forum, Significant Covert CIA Assistance, channeled through the Farfield Foundation and other CIA-controlled funding fronts. The MoMA's most important traveling exhibitions of the 1,950 Seconds, the New American Painting in 1958 to 59, Modern Art in the United States in 1955 to 56, prominently featured Pollock and the other so-called abstract expressionists. These exhibitions traveled to major European capitals, including Paris, London, Berlin, Brussels, Madrid, and Milan. They were the first systematic introduction of American post-war painting to mass European audiences. Why did the CIA care about abstract expressionism? The answer, as Saunders, Cockcroft, and other scholars have reconstructed it, is that the agency saw American abstract painting as an effective cultural counter-narrative to Soviet socialist realism, Soviet propaganda painting in the 1,950 Seconds. Under the Stalinist socialist realism doctrine was, by definition, representational narrative, and overtly political American abstract expressionism was the diametric opposite, non-representational, gestural, individually expressive, free from political content. The CIA's interest was specifically in showing that American culture produced free, individual, nonconformist artistic expression of a kind that Soviet culture could not. Pollock, with his cowboy painter persona, his commercial paint techniques, his individualistic working method, his association with American working-class authenticity, was a near-perfect exemplar for the cultural diplomacy narrative the CIA wanted to promote. How directly did this benefit Pollock himself? It is important to be precise here. There is no documentary evidence that the CIA directly funded Pollock's gallery shows, his paintings, or his personal income. There is documentary evidence that the CIA, through covert funding of the MoMA's International Council and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, helped finance the international touring exhibitions that established Pollock and de Kooning, Rothko, Klein, Motherwell, Newman, and others as the major American post-war painters in European critical discourse. In other words, the CIA did not pay for Pollock to paint his canvases. The canvases were already painted, but the CIA, through its cultural diplomacy programs, paid significant amounts toward the international exhibition machinery that promoted those canvases to European audiences and that established Pollock's name in European critical writing. This is not the same as saying Pollock was a CIA project. He was not, but the international half of his fame, the half that placed him at the center of European modernist discourse in the 1,960 Seconds and 1,970 Seconds, was substantially financed by covert American government cultural programs. In the 70 years since Pollock's death, his market has followed an exceptional trajectory. His paintings, almost from the moment of his death, became the most expensive American paintings of the post-war period. In 1985, the Tate Gallery in London paid £5 million for Pollock's Summertime, number 9A, 1948. In 2006, the Mexican financier David Martinez purchased Pollock's number 5, 1948 from David Geffen for a reported $140 million, which made it briefly the most expensive painting ever sold. In 2015, a 1949 Pollock Drive IP painting sold privately for a reported $200 million. Adjusted for inflation, Several of Pollock's major works are now worth more than the entire combined output of many mid-tier 19th century American artists. A market valuation that is, by any honest assessment, partly driven by the cultural, historical narrative of the lone American genius that the post-war institutional apparatus constructed and that the CIA's cultural diplomacy reinforced. Recent art historical scholarship has begun to revise the standard narrative in three specific ways. 1. The contributions of Lee Krasner. Krasner, after Pollock's death in 1956, produced major paintings of her own through the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds. She has been increasingly recognized as a significant abstract expressionist in her own right, rather than merely as Pollock's wife. The Whitney Museum and the Tate Modern have both organized major retrospectives of her work in the past 2 decades. 2. The role of women painters who preceded Pollock. Janet Sobel's contributions to drip painting are now widely acknowledged in serious art historical literature, even though they were almost entirely effaced from popular accounts in the 950 seconds and 1960 seconds. 3. The role of Mexican and indigenous influences on Pollock's technique. The contributions of siqueiros, of the Mexican mural tradition more broadly, and of Native American sand painting have been increasingly documented in academic Pollock studies. None of this diminishes Pollock's actual achievements. The 1947 to 1952 Pascal's Intings remain extraordinary works of art, but the standard narrative of Pollock as a solitary American genius inventing drip painting from nothing, a narrative useful both to American galleries selling his work and to American government cultural diplomats promoting it abroad, is a simplification that erases significant prior work and significant collaborative influence. Jackson Pollock's story, in its full arc, raises a question that I think is worth sitting with. How much of any major artist's reputation is the artist's own work, and how much of it is the cultural and institutional machinery that selects, promotes, and amplifies that work? Pollock made genuine innovations. He produced extraordinary paintings during a 5-year window. He died young after a long period of unproductive alcoholism. None of his actual contribution is in question, but the standard story of his fame, the narrative that placed his work at the center of post-war American culture, was the result of a specific institutional alignment. Greenberg's critical advocacy, the MoMA's institutional positioning, Life magazine's photographic mythology, the CIA's cultural diplomacy funding of European exhibitions, Lee Krasner's careful posthumous stewardship of his estate, the auction market's increasing financial validation through the second half of the century. Take away any one of those elements, and Pollock's posthumous standing in the canon would be different. Take away the CIA's funding of European exhibitions, and his international reputation in the 1960 seconds would have been smaller. Take away Krasner's estate management, and many of his works would have been less well preserved and less well documented. Take away Life magazine, and his image as the cowboy painter would never have become the cultural shorthand it became. None of this is unique to Pollock. It is in fact how all major artistic reputations are constructed. There is no neutral cultural marketplace. There are choices made by curators, critics, dealers, foundations, museums, and as the Pollock case shows, intelligence agencies. Those choices shape who we now consider the great painters of any period. The actual paintings on the walls are, in any honest reckoning, only part of the story. On the 11th of August, 1956, Jackson Pollock died in a car crash on a rural Long Island road. He left behind approximately 40 completed canvases from his 5-year drip period, plus a body of earlier and later work that is, by general consensus, less significant. The 40 canvases hang in major museums around the world. They are admired, photographed, replicated on coffee mugs and posters and laptop sleeves, and they are, in their own terms, beautiful. But what we should remember is that the painter who made them was not a unique genius operating in isolation from history. He was a working artist who absorbed influences from women painters, from Mexican muralists, from indigenous American traditions, and from European modernism. He drank heavily. He fought constantly with his wife. He died young in a self-inflicted accident. His paintings became culturally enormous because of a particular post-war moment in which American institutions, some private, some governmental, some covert, decided that American painting needed to be enormous. The paintings are still on the walls. They will remain there. What is changing slowly is our willingness to tell the whole story of how they got there.